My name is Karl Skorecki, and I want to first and foremost thank Professor Peretz-Levi, the president, for giving me the honor and privilege of serving as a moderator for such an important and historic dialogue. I'm starting to feel what whoever it was who introduced Einstein when he came to the Technion must have felt thinking ahead of time, or when the Maimonides was called to the pulpit, someone introduced him and they must have felt something. So that's the kind of a feeling of hitrachshut emotion I have. President Professor Peretz-Levi, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, distinguished Professor Aaron Ciechanover. Shortly we'll be joined by the chair of the board, Larry Chakir, board members, administration, and executive leadership of the Technion, guests, friends of the Technion, good morning and welcome to all. We're really honored and excited today to host at the Technion one of the Jewish world's most renowned and respected persons, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. We're fortunate to have a faculty member and a colleague who is a 2004 Nobel Laureate in chemistry as a co-discussant in what promises to be a historic dialogue here at the Technion. I invite you both to join me on stage, and I invite the audience to welcome with applause. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs' life work can be considered as synonymous with the word faith in all of its complexity. He's a leader, philosopher, author, and moral voice for our time, within the Jewish world and beyond. Rabbi Lord Sachs was awarded the 2016 Templeton Prize, just a small sampling of the many prizes, in recognition of his exceptional contributions to affirming life's spiritual dimension, described by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, as a light unto this nation, referring to the British nation, and of course the Jewish nation, and by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as an intellectual giant. Rabbi Sachs is a frequent and sought-after contributor to broadcast media and press worldwide. Since completing his term as Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, a position he served for 22 years, Rabbi Sachs has held a number of professorships at academic institutions, including Yeshiva University, King's College. In addition to his prolific scholarly writing and lecturing, he currently serves as the Ingeborg and Ira Rennert Global Distinguished Professor at NYU. New York University. Rabbi Sachs has been awarded 17 honorary doctorates. I don't know if that includes last night's. 18. Chai, 18, right. So Chai honorary doctorates, thank you. Update. Ken Yerbu, including Doctor of Divinity, conferred to mark the 10th year in his office as Chief Rabbi by then Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey. Rabbi Sachs was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen in 2005, made a life peer, taking his seat in the House of Lords in October 2009. He's the author of over 30 books. Among them, he has published a new English translation and commentary for the Koren Sachs Siddur, the first new Orthodox Siddur in a generation, as well as powerfully insightful commentaries for the High Holiday and Festival Machzorim. His most recent work, Not in God's Name, or one of his most recent works, Confronting Religious Violence, was awarded the 2015 National Jewish Book Award in America. It was a top 10 Sunday Times bestseller in the UK. Past works include The Great Partnership, which is obviously particularly relevant to today's discussion, The Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, winner of the Graumeyer Prize for Religion in 2004, and To Heal a Fractured World, The Ethics of Responsibility, A Letter in the Scroll, and others. His Covenant and Conversation commentaries on the weekly Torah portion are read in Jewish communities around the world, including by myself every week. In recognition of his work, Rabbi Sachs has received, among others, the Jerusalem Prize. I won't give all the institutional affiliations because it'll just take too long. The Ladislas Lasht Ecumenical and Social Concern Award, 2011, the Guardian of Zion Award from Bar Ilan, the Katz Award, and many others. He was named as the Beckett Fund's 2014 Canterbury Medalist for his role in defense of religious liberty, and that same year was conferred the Rambam Award here in Haifa. He won a Bradley Prize in 2016 in recognition of being a leading moral voice in today's world. In 2017, he was awarded the Irving Kristol Prize from the American Enterprise Institute for his remarkable contributions to philosophy, religion, and interfaith discourse as one of the world's greatest living public intellectuals. In 2018, the Lifetime Achievement Award was conferred upon Rabbi Lord Sachs by the London Jewish News in recognition of his services to the Jewish world and wider society. And of course, the honorary doctorate at the Technion. Distinguished Professor Aaron Ciechanover was born in Haifa, with his history is the history of Israel, in 1947. He received his master's in 71, MD in 73 from Hebrew University, then completed his national service as a military physician and continued his studies to obtain a doctorate in biochemistry at the Technion's Faculty of Medicine. There, as a graduate student under the supervision of Professor Avram Hershko and in collaboration with Professor Erwin Rose from the Fox Chase Cancer Center, they discovered that the covalent attachment of ubiquitin to a target protein signals it for degradation. Their further research deciphered the mechanisms of conjugation, described the general functions of the system, and developed a model for cellular protein turnover in all living systems. As a postdoctoral fellow with Harvey Lodish at MIT, Professor Ciechanover continued his research of the ubiquitin system, made additional important discoveries. In subsequent years, it became clear that this system plays a major role in almost every significant cellular process in nature. Aberrations in the system underline the pathogenic mechanism of many diseases, among them cancer and neurodegenerative disorders. Consequently, the system has become an important platform for drug development. Among the numerous prizes Professor Ciechanover received, of course, are the 2000 Albert Lasker Award, the 2003 Israel Prize, and, of course, the 2004 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Among many academies, Professor Ciechanover is a member of the Israel National Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, the National Academy of Medicine in the US, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences of the Vatican, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I'm sure more will come. So the title of the discussion is, of course, Does God Play Dice? A Dialogue on Science and Religion. On a personal note, let me say that I've read almost, or most of Rabbi Lord Sachs' books, and they have inspired me greatly. Also, I follow his writings related to the weekly Torah reading, as I mentioned, as well as numerous other essays and writings. Obviously, the Great Partnership might be considered most relevant to today's discussion. Professor Ciechanover and I have had an ongoing friendship since the early 1980s when he was in Boston, and so was I. I can't think of a scientific colleague more appropriate for today's dialogue with Rabbi Lord Sachs than a Nobel Laureate in chemistry who has made a transformative discovery that's completely changed the understanding of life and yet remains Professor Ciechanover, deeply respectful of religious tradition and its influence. Obviously, the term God does not play dice with the universe, coined by Albert Einstein, doesn't really directly relate to what I think will turn into the topic of today's dialogue. At the time, Einstein made this comment in relation to theories, I think it was 1927, of the emerging quantum physical view of the universe, and it is interesting that the Technion, of course, has just launched a major initiative in quantum physics. Nevertheless, the inherent question, does God play dice with the universe, meant to deal with probabilistic aspects of quantum theory, has been adopted in discussions of the interrelationship between faith and science. So we will use this latter attribution and connotation in framing today's discussion. With some prior discussion with Professor Ciechanover and Rabbi Sachs, the framework for today's dialogue will be in the form of 2 or 3 questions. And I'll let each one actually pose the question to the other in greater detail and have a response. So the first, in an age where scientific advancement is forging ahead so rapidly with, for example, human capacity to modify the genome of future generations, generate new life forms, what is the role and method of moral, religious, and religious leadership to science? The second question will be, how does the scientific world deal with the notion of the Hebrew expression, hakol tzafui v'reshut netuya, predeterminism and free will in the natural world? And Rabbi Sachs can certainly formulate that question in a deeply religious and philosophical manner. And then at the end, if there's time, I will ask both discussants, as they close, to think of if we had, and this is the closest we'll get to having Maimonides and Einstein in the room with us, what new insights might they have more than 850 and more than 100 years later, respectively, about the complementarity or contradictory relationship of science and religious faith? We won't have time to address many other burning issues, such as theodicy, why there's evident evil in the world, when there's a beneficent, omnipotent God, and others, which Rabbi Sachs has written a great deal about and which is addressed and allowed to be asked in Judaism and other faiths. So I'm going to sit down and ask Professor Ciechanover to pose the first question to Rabbi Sachs and expand on it in his eloquent manner.
Well, good morning, friends and colleagues. First of all, I really want to commend the president of the Technion, my colleague Professor Peretz Lavi, the management of the Technion, for having at all this discussion here. It shouldn't be taken for granted. Not in any university, in particular not in the Technion. This is an engineering school of not only engineering, sciences, medicine. It lacks a major arm that other universities have, which is humanities. And nevertheless, it feels itself responsible to the quality of its graduates, not only on the technological side, not only on the professional side, but also on the humanitarian and societal side. And I think that this kind of dialogue is only one single reflection of this responsibility that this institute has undertaken upon itself. So that's for the beginning. Let me just start with a little bit of a personal experience of this broad question and where I want to take it. In the last 15 years or so, I've been lectured numerous lectures, mostly to children and to people who are just growing up. And one of the questions that I'm typically asked, especially by children, and they are not shying out, is whether there is God or there isn't God. And they are looking for a very simple question, yes or no. And when I start to kind of mumble around or stutter, they pinpoint to me and they tell me, I ask you, what is the answer? Is there God or isn't God? And then the question is coming in different flavors. Is there a contradiction between being a scientist and being a believing person? Doesn't matter whether you are Jew or not. Is there an inherent built-in contradiction between being a scientist and or whether, if they are a little bit more sophisticated, whether Darwin and God can live in the same room, in the same apartment? Whether the two theories, one the basic theory of science and the fundamental theory of creation and other beliefs can be under the same roof and whether they are not inherently contradictory. So this question is coming up. Of course, there is no simple question to this many questions that I'm being asked, and they are all in the eyes of the beholder. You know, and the range of the beholders is as broad as you can imagine, from followers, Hasidim shel the intelligent design theory on one hand, and until a fanatic Darwinist, and everybody in between. And it depends whoever you ask, and you will hear myriad of different answers. So we already know that there is no a simple answer for that. Part of the questions that are being asked are also part of a kind of a discussant atmosphere that is being accentuated these days worldwide, but in particular in the state of Israel, and it's about a confusion. People are asking what I call questions in order to anger you, in order to probe you, in order to sting you, because there is a confusion between the principles of religious, the morality behind it, and the people that somehow appointed themselves to become ambassadors of God on earth, political leaders and so on and so forth. And people are confused about the identification between the religion and the leaders that are misleading them and so on and so forth. So we should clean a little bit the background and deal just with the principle, forgetting about what's going on or trying to forget about what's going on. Now, when I'm coming to the question itself, and scientists like myself are used to get there is a scientific method, and the scientific method talks a scientific language. And when we are asking a question, we have an experimental system, we go to the laboratory, we go to the literature, we are using different tools in order to answer it. But think about it, our language is nevertheless limited. It's the scientific language. It's a language that we understand. There are no language that we can get an answer which we don't understand the language. And therefore, the question about God, for me, is kind of completely irrelevant. It's an irrelevant question, because if the existence of God, any God, can be translated into a scientific language, then it's not God anymore. So I think that this question should not be asked. It's completely irrelevant to us. And therefore, we want to take the discussion to, I want to take the discussion or the dialogue to somewhere, to a completely different place. And I think that the dialogue today should be about partnership, about collaboration, a necessary collaboration, an important collaboration between science and religious, any religious, and we happen to be, most of us, Jews, so Certainly that Judaism will come strong along this dialogue. And I think that this dialogue and this partnership, it's essential. It's fundamental to the existence of these two apparently separate entities. And I think that it comes from two different needs, this type of partnership and collaboration. One is the need of the scientist to have moral leaders that will mediate between them and the audience and the people. There are major scientific questions that are coming up that are stemming from misunderstanding of science, and there is no way in the world that the scientists themselves can carry out the mission to convince the people that the solution to those problems is scientific. Think about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. There are countries, the entire continents, Africa, India, will starve to death without introduction of GMOs that are resistant to climate changes, to pesticides, to harmful insects, and so on and so forth. But there is also a complete misunderstanding of people about GMOs, and the resistance to GMO comes mostly from religious reasons that God, the Almighty, doesn't want us to change genetically its organisms and so on and so forth. Just keep it as it was created. And we need these leaders in order to mediate between us and the people, in order to prevent a major, huge disaster. We cannot do it ourselves. People will not listen to us. Think about climate change, the same very story. Religious origin. God will not harm us. He will not change climate and will not harm us, will not poke holes in the ozone in order to harm us. So why there is a climate change at all? There isn't a climate change. We deny it. People deny it. We need these people, these leaders. The people will follow them. The people are following them in order to help us convince the politicians and the crowd to support us in preventing this big disaster. So one reason that we need them as mediators, that's my view. The other reason, which is as important, it's the inability of scientists, of physicians, to lift with themselves, to lift with their own power, the burden of the implication of their own research. We are doing research, but the implications are so heavy that we cannot lift it ourselves. There is no way in the world that we can lift it ourselves. I just want to mention something that Karl mentioned in his intro words, and that's personalized medicine. Nowadays, we can predict our future, something that we couldn't do before. By simple sequencing of DNA, and well, I'm oversimplifying things. In the RNA and the proteins, we are able to predict that mutations will lead to cancer in a few years. We are able to predict that certain mutations will lead to Alzheimer's disease, and so on and so forth. And the implications of this knowledge are huge. Who we are to answer the questions of patients about it, about the family implication, the employer's implication, the insurance agent's implication, and so on and so forth. What happens to me if I go to the emergency room and people tell me, well, we sequence your DNA and you don't have a heart attack, but in 10 years you're going to develop Alzheimer's? What? What am I going to do with it? Shall I tell my employer? Shall I tell my family? My children that may carry the genes themselves? We need the help, the moral help, the wisdom, the cleverness of leaders that together with us will solve not only the personal problem, but the societal problem. It's going to be a problem that we are in society are going to face, all of us. Then there is a question of gene editing. The definition of a disease. Until now, disease was defined as simple. You have a high fever, you cannot get up in the morning and go to work. This was a disease, and then you call the doctor. From now on, by looking at the genome, the mothers will say that she doesn't like that the newborn will be a girl or a boy, blonde or black hair, tall or low, and so on. In her eyes, in the eyes of the beholder, it's a disease. Should we change it? Think about the diversity of the world. Think what the diversity of the world added to us, that we are so different from one another. Not only men and women talking different languages, different cultures, different music, different everything, different foods. That makes us a wonderful society. Now the idea to manipulate it, me, the scientist, will decide about it. Think about how much, and I'm not going, it's a very sensitive issue. The people among us who are limited, the handicapped, added to us as human beings. Think about a world without handicapped people. I'm not preaching that they will be handicapped and we should correct it. But not every defect is a handicap. Think about how much they added to our society, building institutions to them, how they develop mercifulness, and so on and so forth. Are we going to erase all that? Are we going to equalize ourselves to generate people that we look just alike? I'm not the one to decide. I can provide the tools, the scientific tools, but I need people like Rabbi Sachs in order to help me to solve this problem for the benefit of society. We are generating problems, scientists in their laboratories, that they cannot lift the burden to solve them. And it's coming, and it's behind the wall. It's behind the corner. And we do need to solve it. The last point that I just want to raise in my intro words is, of course, why do I need Rabbi Sachs? Why shouldn't I need Karl Popper? Why shouldn't I need myself as a moral personality? I believe that I'm moral. I can consult with friends. Why do I need to stick to religious people? Well, this is a little bit more difficult question, but I have an answer for that. First of all, for me personally, I'm Jewish, I'm an Israeli, and I have a home. And the home is Judaism. So why should I choose another home? And the home satisfies all my needs. And I'll point to you in a minute or during the conversation why the Jewish home satisfies all my questions that I just posed. It has all the answers for it. So why to change? And on top of it, it's also the definition of religion. Why do I need to hold? For me, religion is not only the set of orders in the Torah and what was added to it along the generation in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. It's also history. It's the country. It's the music. It's the people. It's the language. And I want just to end up this with a sentence from a prayer that I really adore and love and listen to it repeatedly and repeatedly. And this keta, this portion is called "V'liyerushalayim ircha." And it says, "V'liyerushalayim ircha, berachamim tashuv, v'tishkon betocha ka'asher dibarta." To the city of Jerusalem, which is your city, the city of God, you will come back with mercy. And you will live there as you promised us. That's what the sentence says. Think about the linkage between Yerushalayim, the current capital of the state of Israel, but the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years, ותשכון, שכינה. We are talking about the שכינה, שבאה לשכון בירושלים. Think about this linkage. So religious is much more than that. And of course, Jerusalem is close to all of us. So I think that these links make me not only Jewish, but in great need for moral Jewish leaders in order to solve all the problems that I just posed.
I'm not sure Professor Ciechanover needs that much help, but I think many of us do. Many scientists do. And he articulated some of the challenges. And Rabbi Sachs, can you help us out?
Yeah, since Professor Ciechanover gave a general introduction, let me just respond to that. First of all, to begin at the end, v'tishkon b'tocha. The word shechina and the word shachen are related. Shachen is your next door neighbor. Hashem is close. If you're Jewish, Hashem is close. And we say, Avinu Malkeinu. Hashem may be a king, but he's also our father. And this reminded me of that wonderful thing in the 1980s. They had these big billboards in New York saying, you have a friend in the Chase Manhattan Bank. And an Israeli wrote underneath, but in Bank Leumi, you have mishpocha. So, you know, in Judah, everyone has God as a friend, but in Judaism, that's mishpocha, you know, Avinu Malkeinu, and he is our shachen. Just to, as it were, to add a footnote to what you were saying, Einstein famously said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. And I think the most important thing we need to know on both sides is a sense of humility. When religious people claim to know about what is and what isn't scientifically true, then we are really back in the dark ages. And likewise, when we get scientists, some of the very angry atheists who believe that God is an old man with a long white beard, and his name is Charles Darwin. So when you get scientists pronouncing on religion, that's also not great. So it is a partnership. I believe in principle, in Judaism, there can be no contradiction between science and religion, because the God of creation is the God of revelation. That is the fundamental statement. So what is true about creation must be consistent with what is true about revelation. We'd have different names for God of creation and God of revelation. God of creation we call Elohim. God of revelation we call Hashem. And at the climax of the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur, at Ne'ilah, we say 7 times, Hashem hu ha'Elohim. So we are emphasizing that partnership between the two very fundamentally. Why do we need both? Because as the great Scottish 18th century philosopher David Hume said, you cannot infer an ought from an is. Science tells us what is and how it came to be. Religion tells us what ought to be, and you can't derive one from the other. And that is why I think they become terribly important to be in constant conversation with one another, open and conversation. And where I think Judaism is a little different from some other faiths is that many other faiths are religions of acceptance. Judaism is a religion of protest. It is Avram who says, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yazeh mishpat. It is Moshe Rabbeinu who says, Lama harayota lama zeh. So we do not take the poverty and disease and all the other 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. We don't take them as written into the fabric of the universe. We believe that it is our role to eliminate as far as we can disease, poverty, and all the rest. And therefore, very often religious people object to scientific interventions. They call it playing God. Whereas we say, no, God wants us to be his shutafim b'maaseh bereshit, his partner. And therefore, I think Judaism has always had and always should have a very open attitude to science. We coined a bracha for seeing a non-Jewish scientist, Asher natan me chochmato levasav v'dam, which I always recite on meeting a Nobel Prize winner. So I hope that I hope you were. I was Yotze with that bracha, Professor Ciechanover. And of course, but when you're talking about genetic intervention to deal with the specifics, you know that famous legendary Yiddish translation of Shakespeare, which had on the front page "verteidigt und verbessert," translated and improved. So. So I always think some kinds of genetic intervention or some theoretical possibilities are like that. Don't try and improve on Shakespeare. Don't try and improve on nature, on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's one of the points Ramban makes very strongly in his commentary to the Torah. But there is a fundamental distinction that we have to make between therapeutic and eugenic interventions. To use genetic interventions to cure hereditary disease. This is not just permitted, it is a mitzvah. It is God's work. But to do it for eugenic reasons, I think is very, very questionable. Let me explain why it's questionable. Number one, it will immediately introduce a major distinction between people who can afford it and people who can't. And the very fact that we say of each of us that we are B'Tselem U'Demut Elokim, we are each in the image of God, gives us all equal dignity. But if you can buy your way to have super intelligent children, I think that would introduce a kind of ontological inequality that would be very dangerous. Number two, any germline intervention by definition will have consequences for all future generations. And you have to think 10 times before you do what no life form has ever done before, which is intervene in its own evolution. And I think that's highly problematic. And the other thing is, are we sure we know enough? Was it Donald Rumsfeld who talked about the difference between known unknowns and unknown unknowns. I once had a conversation with a well-known Darwinian atheist, Richard Dawkins, and I said, Richard, you're a Darwinist, right? When the human genome was first decoded, people were surprised to find that only 2% of DNA coded for protein, and they called the other 98% junk DNA. He said, right. And I said, am I right in thinking that just a couple of years, it was just a week after they'd announced that 450 experiments in universities throughout the world, and they discovered that actually the 98% of junk DNA isn't junk at all. And it's essential. And he said, yes, 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 absolutely. And I said, Richard, don't you think that 98% of religion is junk? He said, yes. I said, might you not be wrong about that as well? He sensibly didn't answer. But if you think about the fact that 20 years ago, we were talking about genetic determinism. And now I think anyone speaking about the subject would say, well, what about epigenetics? What about gene expression and so on? So these are the unknown unknowns, the things we discover that we didn't know we didn't know. And I think if you're going to actually intervene in evolution, something, as I say, never been done before. Certainly in the case of genetically modified crops, we agree that's a great blessing to humankind, not a great threat. But to intervene in our own human nature, I think you have to think many, many times. So therapeutic, yes. Eugenic, no.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Yeah, the border. And
the border is fuzzy. That's the problem. And you're absolutely right. I don't know that anyone's quite been able to determine that, and that's the problem. That's the challenge.
Rabbi Sachs, can you delve a little more deeply into the specific point raised by Professor Ciechanover about religious leadership as opposed to secular moral leadership, and what is the specific role in that regard when most people in the world have a faith or religious on various poles and so forth? What is it special? What's special about that?
Well, first of all, I think, let's just be a little provocative here. Richard Dawkins invented the word meme, which is a cultural equivalent of a gene. And, you know, like a song that goes, or a YouTube video that goes viral, you know, it's like a gene that spreads itself in a population. And religion is the world's most successful meme. Judaism has been around twice as long as Christianity, 3 times as long as Islam, and still, you know, we who identify with it can still say after an unparalleled history of suffering, Am Yisrael Chai, we're still here, we're still young. So I think if you wanted scientific evidence that certain forms of codes of behavior lead to human flourishing, I don't think you could be better than that. But I do feel that there's one other factor here, which is if you believe in God, or you believe in, you know, or Einstein and Spinoza's God even, you have a certain humility. And the great danger in science today is we'll do it because we can, not we'll do it because we should. And religion is the voice of should. And of course it can be challenged. I don't think that any religion has a monopoly on wisdom, and I think secular humanists have added hugely to our moral vocabulary. But I do think religion here should give us a sense of humility and pause to think what we're doing before we do it.
Thank you. Rabbi Sachs, you mentioned, and I mentioned in my introductory remarks, free will and determinism, whether it be genetic determinism, quantum predeterminism. I wonder what scientists think, Aaron, about what is a scientist's view of to what extent we have free will or are programmed to act in certain ways. What responsibility does a person have or carry who has a genetic predisposition to a certain behavior which is not acceptable to society? What is your view as a scientist of that? And then maybe Rabbi Sachs can then add.
Coming back to the question that just was posed by Rabbi Sachs, what we should do and what we should not do in science, and we should be very careful about it. Of course, in our society, we have different checks and balances. Mostly, I always say that democracy may not be the ideal system, but at least the optimal system, because you know, we are doing in the laboratory what we are funded for doing, and in order to get funding, you have to write a proposal. So some other pairs of eyes look at the proposal and approve. I'm not talking about doing things under the table or in an immoral way. And then you have students, and you educate your student for morality, and you encourage them to think independently, and so on. So you are not alone in this field to decide for yourself, okay, let's clone now new breed of Nazis that will walk out of the cellar one day and will do whatever they have to do. We are not, but I think that nevertheless, the question for scientists is awfully sensitive. It can be put under the word academic freedom, and not in the sense of the discussion with the politicians, what we can say or what we cannot say, but rather what we should do, because we should be very careful not to cross the border that by saying, no, we cannot do it, we are not blocking progress of science. So it's a very sensitive border. I can bring you something which is kind of floating extremely strongly in our eyes, and it comes to a scientist that is very much doubtful, or not doubtful, that is very, very much in discussion these days, Jim Watson. Jim Watson is the father of the double helix, in my opinion, probably one, I don't know, I cannot enumerate it, number one or number two, one of the most important discoveries ever made. The double helix of the DNA, which has in it the secrets of who we are. You know, the replication of information, the transmission of information transgenerationally, and so on and so forth. And he is very blunt, and I met him several times. We had discussions about it, about Judaism, about why Jews have more Nobel Prize than others. It slided to all kinds of extremely sensitive issue. And he bluntly said, in the open, that certain races are inferior to others, without mentioning it. Of course, it raised huge havoc, and he was fired from his position, and so on and so forth. So think about the question. Should we study the issue of intelligence in different ethnic groups? Just the question. It's a very interesting scientific question, extremely interesting scientific question. Why people are different in their intelligence. Forget about even ethnic groups. Should we study it or not study it? Because it can lead to improvement of intelligence, of performance. You know, the implications, the positive implications are huge, are tremendous. But nevertheless, at the same time, it can destroy our society. It can lead to such a shakeup and riots and bitterness and in the society. So this is type of a question that scientists cannot answer themselves. On one hand, I'm curious the next day, tomorrow, to go to my lab and to understand what's going on, what is the variety, where the variety is coming from. But on the other hand, I'm aware to the risk. And this is just one question. I can sit with you here forever and bring up and up additional questions that it's really, they are extremely sensitive, society-wise, religious-wise, nation-wise, any-wise, and we should really discuss it among ourselves and with leaders. Scientists are not the ones to give the answer. Actually, it will be dangerous if we will give the scientists to answer this type of questions. And therefore, the issue of what to study and what not to study, what should be done and what shouldn't be done, where are the borders between therapeutic and eugenic? This is exactly type of a question, because you may argue that intelligence, when it's lower, below certain border, becomes therapeutic. Yeah. So the border is not defined. There is a huge twilight zone between these two. It's easy to say therapeutics and eugenics, but both of us, I'm sure, agree that the twilight zone in between the two is more vague than we can even imagine. So that's why, again, we need such a discussion and a dialogue in our society, which has direct implication, to our progress as society, what we can study and what we cannot study. I'm not talking about developing, and the same is coming to studying new strains of influenza virus that can be harmful and can spread out of the window, and it just came to the discussion just a year ago with Ron Frauscher, the Dutch scientist that published a new sequence of a new HN5 virus that is more violent than others, and people thought that other parties can abuse it in order to develop modern, novel, aggressive biological warfare agent and so on and so forth. And it's coming non-stop. And these questions, unfortunately, Karl, are not discussed in our society.
Well, we have an opportunity here. It sounds like what,
so
great...
I wanted just to kind of give you an example of what is the severity, what are the heavy weight of these problems that were just raised in this borderline between eugenic and therapeutic.
It sounds like the discussion with the great James Watson. Of course, Rosalind Franklin did the experiment upon which, remember that, upon which James Watson inferred with Crick the double helix. You have to always remember that, as I think Brenda Maddox wrote in her book from England. There's a lack of humility, I guess, in what Rabbi Sachs was saying and what James Watson said. That's what he sounds like the flaw. So I'd like Rabbi Sachs to respond and perhaps speak more specifically about free will and...
Sure. The idea that you judge people by their IQ alone is a damaging idea. And it's an example of how well-intentioned science can sometimes be very short-sighted. And we sometimes read to realize that everyone has a kisheron, a role to fulfill, that everyone is special. And we should never rank people by these very narrow criteria. But to come now to the specifics, I hate to disappoint you on this one, but everyone gets that sentence wrong. Hakol tzafui ureshut netuna is taken not least by Rambam himself to mean everything is foreseen, seen in advance, and yet freedom of choice is given. But it was the late Professor Ephraim Auerbach who pointed out that in Mishnaic Hebrew, and this is a Mishnah from Rabbi Akiva in Pirkei Avot, in Mishnaic Hebrew, tzafui does not mean foreseen, it means seen. In other words, you can do what you like, reshut netuna, but God is watching you. You're on CCTV, right? Hashem is following you very closely. So this whole foreknowledge and free will question comes from the outside into Judaism. It comes from essentially Aristotelian science. For the Greeks, if you were the supreme being, you were beyond change and beyond time. Whereas for Jews, God lives within time. So this is a Greek mistranslation that entered Judaism when, in the Middle Ages, people started doing neo-Aristotelian and neo-Platonic philosophy. I think we've got enough resources to do our own philosophy, frankly. But here it is. We now know all sorts of stuff that illustrate human free will that we didn't know 50 years ago. Number one, the extreme plasticity of the brain. We can actually, by acting differently, reconfigure the architecture of the brain, which is what the Sefer HaChinuch means when he says, Acharei ha'pu'ulot nimshechu halevavot. But of course, in levavot here, he means the mind. He doesn't mean just the emotions. Number two, we learned very clearly from another Jewish Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, that there's two systems in the brain, thinking fast and thinking slow. Thinking fast comes from the limbic system or the amygdala. It's either the reptile brain or the chimpanzee brain. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, the thinking slow. And that, I think, is what Rambam meant when he said, Tzarech Adam some deotav tamid. In other words, always pause before reacting. Otherwise, you really will lose your free will. You know, it's said that whenever the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, got angry, he would take out half a dozen books of Jewish law to work out, is it permitted to be angry on an occasion like that? And after he'd taken all those books, how could he be angry anymore? I mean, so if you pause, you will actually exercise your freedom. My view of chukim, of para aduma, for instance, or shatnez, or kalayim, is actually a means of bypassing the neofrontal cortex and actually directly impacting on reactions that you're not conscious of having. You know, para aduma and the fact that the mate, the dead person, is of avot hatuma, the paradigm of impurity is Judaism's defense mechanism against the worship of death. The Egyptians believed it's in death that you join the gods. Christians very often believed that the afterlife is the most important thing, as did Muslims. And we said, no, v'charta v'chaim. God wants us to be religious down here on earth. So just like we don't know where Moses was buried, so that we couldn't make a cult of a dead leader, so God is saying in Parashat Chukat, if you've been in contact with death, that doesn't make you holy, that makes you tameh. And you have to purify yourself from it. So, and that operates at a deeper level of the brain because that can be done behaviorally. And of course, finally, the Rambam does define in chapter 5 of Hilchot Tshuva our belief in free will as one of the principles of Jewish faith. As Isaac Bashevis Singer famously said, we've got to be free, we have no choice. So Jews really believe in free will. And that means that I think sometimes scientists don't fully realize what we will lose if we lose the belief in free will. I did a television program with Colin Blakemore, who's the professor of neuroscience at Oxford. He is a hard determinist. He believes we have no choice at all. I said, Colin, if that is so, then why on earth should we have laws, courts, and punishments? Because if we weren't free to choose, then we can't be guilty and we shouldn't be punished. The Rambam says this. If we have no free will, why do we have laws? Why do we have schava onesh? Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. He actually writes this. I said, Colin, if you really believe what you're telling me you believe, then society ought to perform neurosurgery on criminals instead of sending them to prison. He said to me, well, I can see in a totalitarian state they might want to do that. But if you don't believe we have freedom, why should we want a free society? And I don't think people realize just how dangerous it is to deny free will. We now know the neuroscience of what it takes to pause and so on. So I think the Jewish insistence on free will here is actually necessary for the future of humanity.
Thank you. Rabbi Sachs, Professor Ciechanover, and you and I spoke a little bit in advance about you mentioned the word danger, Rabbi mentioned the word danger, disenlightenment, a trend in society away from enlightenment, and what I would like to ask both of you, what the scientific and religious leadership world should do to bring us back. And then we have a few minutes. If there's time, we might allow the audience, because this is a golden opportunity, to ask a question or two if there's time. So the danger, is it real? Is there a real perception that something is going on which we should be somewhat wary of in society, a darkening, a disenlightenment? And if so, I hope not, but if so, what can you, Rabbi Sachs, you, Professor Ciechanover, do we're here with the Technion and your universities and in institutions of Jewish scholarly learning. What should we do?
Well, first of all, I think religious leaders really have to seriously learn from scientists. We have to have the humility to know that there's that vast ocean of truth that we as religious leaders don't understand. And we need that lesson in humility. I think we need very open conversations in which we speak and we listen. I always said that good news and bad news about the Jewish people. The good news is we're among the best speakers in the world. The bad news is we're the worst listeners in the world. And sometimes listening is more important than speaking, and that is why in the Siddur, you will see in the current Siddur, I've changed the translation of Shema Yisrael from "Hear, O Israel," to "Listen, O Israel." I've actually deliberately changed it. I really think that Enlightenment values are under threat. Steven Pinker is a good friend. Do you know Steven Pinker, the Harvard neuroscientist? You saw he just brought out a book called Enlightenment Now. You don't write a book called Enlightenment Now, given that the Enlightenment took place in the 18th century, if you're not worried about losing it. And I think we have a duty as Jews to stand up and show the world that we are not threatened by science, that we are enhanced by science, and that together, you know, to quote Tennyson, "Come, friends, 'tis not too late to build a newer world." I really think that scientific possibilities opening up now with nanotechnology, with, do you know, nowadays artificial intelligence can do a retina scan and accurately diagnose up to 40 different kinds of illnesses that affect seeing. Artificial intelligence is going to allow us to diagnose illness, to personalize treatment. These are incredibly life-enhancing things. We're not threatened by them, and we should show that we're really and truly open to science. Christians feel very threatened by Darwinian science. I actually hold that Charles Darwin, without knowing it, you know, alles ist beschert, as I say. We have free will, but God is still moving the pieces. I happen to believe that Charles Darwin stumbled on or came across one of the most profound religious ideas I've ever come across, which is God, the Creator, made creation creative. That is actually what Darwinism is telling us. And he's telling us because everyone in the 18th century thought God was a watchmaker. And it turns out God is more like a gardener than like an engineer. And I think we should be open to that because science can open our eyes to wonder. So I think if both sides have the humility and the openness to one another, we will see which technological advances enhance life and which, God forbid, threaten it.
Ciechanover, are you concerned about the so-called disenlightenment or enlightenment now? Are you a partner to that, and what are you doing about it?
One of the things that I'm doing about it is sitting here and
Excellent.
Just discussing the issue is important, very important. You know, from time to time when I meet people and discuss these questions with, people are telling me, you know, I believe in God, but I don't believe in science. I said, that's wonderful. Science is not a religious. Science is a system of testable hypotheses that you should go to the laboratory, to the computer, to see whether the hypothesis is correct or wrong. And then, if possible, use the implications of your data in order to benefit the lives of people. Develop drugs, develop communication devices, develop whatever you like in order to improve our lives. That's the role of science. Science is basically a technology. It's a system that we are using first and foremost initially to satisfy our curiosity, to understand the universe in which we are living, what's going on around us, and then, of course, to apply it to our own benefit. And the free will that comes with it is, of course, the result of education. And what I'm a little bit concerned is, of course, about education. And since we are in the Technion and we are in the State of Israel, the State of Israel has its particular problems of education where two populations are somehow, it's improving a little bit now, are somehow, from different reasons, out of the realm of education. One is, of course, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, where hundreds of thousands of people are denied what we call the limudei liba, mathematics, English, literature, knowing the world, preparing them. And it's not exclusive at all from Jewish studies, at all. On the contrary, it's complementary. but they are excluded from it, and they are not prepared to living in the modern world, to have a profession, to live decent life, to make decent salary, to educate their own kids, and on top of it, it threatened the very existence of this young, barely surviving Jewish state. And the others are the Arabs that are discriminated politically, but again, there are changes, I hope that for the good, but it's still not in the dimension that we want to see. But again, the free will to choose our way, to make this discussion possible, is all embedded in education. And the state of Israel has a problem in this, not only with this population, also with the secular one, but that can be solved. Then I think that part of the problem is, of course, the lack of enlightenment. Social network, superficiality, the dialogue these days become very superficial, very stormy, very alarming, very violent. You are discriminated, politically if you say one word. I don't want to show you my mail, my email box. I'm a member of the International Board of the New Israeli Fund. I can enlighten you and enrich you with verbally rich terms that I get almost daily to my mailbox. The dialogue has become, we cannot talk anymore. We cannot converse. We don't listen to one another anymore. And I think that it's a worldwide phenomenon. It is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not unique to us. We are free, we are open, and it's coming. And then what to do about it, I cannot offer solutions, but what I'm really worried about and concerned is the lack of the voice of the leadership. The leadership seems to encourage it even, to foster it, to nurture it, to water it, to garden it, rather than coming as the voice of sanity and say, stop, we are destroying ourselves. We don't hear it in Israel, and we don't hear it in the world. And I'm afraid that we are endangering our own existence. I don't know if the physical one, but I think that the world is somehow moving in cycles. And unfortunately, a very destructive war is the initiative for the next development. Think about the world post-World War II, what happened to us. America started to flourish. The American science converted itself from, part of it because of the Jews that migrated from Europe to the United States, from phenomenological to mechanistic. Think about the flourishing, the space industry, the computers. And now it seems that we are not hungry anymore, and we are on the verge of another revolution, and maybe we need another natural disaster. I don't know, I'm not an historian, and history also doesn't tell us what are the rules, but it looks to me like we are moving in cycles. Some of them are constructive, some of them are unfortunately destructive.
Rabbi Sachs, do you have the opportunity to converse with religious and I'm sure you do, religious and educational leaders in the state of Israel, focusing specifically on the future of education and what Professor Ciechanover was speaking about in Israel, and what is your outlook?
Well, first of all, of course I do. I've had conversations with ministers of education here, a series of them. But one of the reasons I wrote my book, The Great Partnership, is that it seemed to me that Israel is productive of this incredible richness of science. If you look from the universities toward the yeshivot, we have more Jews studying at yeshivot today and seminaries than probably at any time in history. A lot more than were in Mir and Ponevezh, probably more than were in Sura and Pumbedita. So I said there is a rare form of cerebral lesion in which the right and left hemispheres of the brain are both intact, but the corpus callosum that joins them is damaged. And the result is dysfunction of personality. I said the Jewish people is suffering that kind of cerebral lesion. So I wanted to show that you can be really quite religious, that you can come with as a chief rabbi. I deliberately published the book while I was still chief rabbi. and Chief Rabbi and of Beit Din, don't forget, and publish a book like The Great Partnership, which says we need both and tries to analyze it as deeply as they can. And I sent this to my own Rav, who is a Rosh Yeshiva here in Israel. And he said, well, you know, he said, I think you should have this immediately translated into Ivrit, which I did. And I'm sure you can get it in paperback, Ashutafut Agdola, or whatever it's called. And so I wanted to show that you can be religious and you can be incredibly open to science. And the truth is that scientists seem to learn from this as well. You know, I love Steven Pinker, who, as a neuroscientist, he is one of America's great atheists. You know, we do great. Christopher Hitchens, you know, the late Christopher Hitchens was a very angry atheist. Hashem has a sense of humor, because Christopher Hitchens discovered shortly before he died that he was Jewish. I don't know if you know this, it's true. He said, at first I was really upset. But then I thought, no, it's good. Jews make the best atheists, you know. Or as Sidney Morgenbesser once said, I don't know why God is so angry with me, just because I don't believe in him. So, you know, I really believe that we as Jews, specifically as Jews, and it can only be done here in Medinat Yisrael, because Jews in Chutz La'aretz can never form a society. We are not, you know, we're on the sidelines. We're a minority. We're a voice, but nothing more. Whereas here in Israel, you know, Hashem is calling, Kol Dodi Dofek, and saying, Rabbanu Shalom, I gave you this wonderful natural universe, and you claim to be worshipping me, and you don't want to understand this intricacy? You don't want to know that in every, that you look up at the sky and you see a universe of 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. You look within the human body and you find more than 1 trillion cells, each of which contains a double copy of the genome, each of which contains, 3.1 billion letters of genetic code. You're not even willing to realize that all life uses the same letters of the genetic code. All life is one. And if that's not Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, I don't know what is. And all of this is so beautiful, and you are closing your eyes to the beauty of science. The Rambam rules in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, chapter 2, halacha 2, that if you want to come to the love and fear of God, study science. You will then realize how vast is the creative power of God, how small we are, and how extraordinary it is that nonetheless God, who is wider than the universe, still lives within the human heart. And that's what I want religious leaders to say. Science has religious dignity to it, and God did not give us a brain simply not to use. You know, says Rashi, Kidmutenu means lahavin ulahaskil. God gave us a brain that we should use, and I think Judaism ought to be proud of being open to science, and I hope science will be open to us as well.
Thank you. I think we'll, with those inspiring words, which deserve a round of applause, we'll draw this very important dialogue to a close. I think that Hiskilu, the leadership of the Technion, Professor Levi, we have other former presidents here, Hiskilu, to really bring this message to Israel and then more broadly, and to have this dialogue today, which I thank both of you for very, very much, and an amazing opportunity, and it'll be able to be seen, I believe, on video around the world, and I'm sure it'll be viewed many times. Thank you very much.